Let's turn now to the study for tonight, Romans 14, Feast and Fast and Food. Romans 14, Unplugged, Feast and Fast and Food. Oh my. And last week we read this paragraph that you have to see on my screen right now that's highlighted in blue. And we're still in the conclusions part where we're looking through basically the background behind Romans 14, trying to ascertain who the players were. We already know that Paul wrote the letter, and we know that he's writing to Jews and Gentiles. But what does he mean by this phrase, weak in faith? Are they weak Christians, both Jews and Gentiles, who lay hold of faith in Jesus, yet are still holding on to Torah observance? Is that what makes them weak? Or instead, are they something else, such as Mark Nanos has proposed, and myself, Tim Haig, and other Messianic Bible teachers. So let's now pick up the rest of my reading here, and we'll read down through this one paragraph, and maybe that'll conclude our study for the Romans, and then we'll focus all the rest of it on the Shema study. Here's what I have to say. Indeed, a concluding remark by James Piles of Morning Meditations drives home one of the central points that Mark Nanos is attempting to convey in his book. And as you're looking at your screen right now, you see I've got Jewish author Mark Nanos. He's a modern author here, as you can see from the picture. And the book that you're seeing on the right side of your screen here, the Mystery of Romans, the black cover with the red writing. That's the book, which is available on Amazon.com or anywhere else. That's the book that is basically driving much of the perspective that I'm working from, that the weak in faith are actually unbelieving Jews. Here's what Nano says from that particular book. So let's pick up the quote here. Quote, according to Nanos, the strong, the believing Gentiles in the synagogue, should have known better than to try to Gentilize the non-believing Jews and thus damaging relationships not only with them, but with the believing Jews who were also continuing to observe Torah and the Jewish customs. Let me pause for a moment and comment on what Nanos is trying to convey. In Paul's day, if you had Gentiles who were believers in Jesus, but yet were not raised with an appreciation for Torah, then it would be natural for those Gentile followers of Jesus to perhaps have a perspective on Israel and on the Torah that was less than positive at all times. And perhaps these Gentiles may have reasoned with themselves that God is doing something new and different with we Gentile Christians, bringing us into a relationship with him through his son Yeshua. And therefore, perhaps we are the focal point. And if that's the case, then maybe this Jewishness to the gospel, this aspect of Judaism and the Torah, maybe that's not as important anymore. Maybe we don't need to focus on all that. Maybe that really is kind of being set aside. So we're talking about as the seeds of replacement theology, supersessionism, a sense where the Christian church is overtaking Israel as the new people group of God, Gentilizing as opposed to Judaizing. But Nano says that if these believing Gentiles were truly strong, like Paul was describing them, like Paul was strong, Paul would certainly not have endorsed any Gentilizing of Jewish peoples. That is to say, where a Gentile Christian seeks to persuade a Jewish person, whether you believer or not believer, but once he makes a profession and becomes a Christian, to try to persuade that Jewish person to give up his Jewishness, to abandon his heritage as a Jew, to give up on his loyalty to Torah, and basically worship God in what would be expressed as a Gentile form of worship, what we call Gentilizing. Much the opposite of what we today would call Judaism, where Jews try to seek to turn Gentiles into otherwise Jews. So Nano says that if they're genuinely strong, they should have known better. They wouldn't be trying to do that. He continues, the Gentiles were cheapening their own freedom in Yeshua faith by suggesting that the Torah devotion of non-believing Jews was a weakness on their part. Now that's very interesting that Nanos would reflect that. That's exactly what I've been saying, is that if the Gentiles in Paul's day were teaching that a preference for keeping Torah on the part of the Jews in the community, that is a signal of their weakness, and that the opposite is true, that freedom in Yeshua is freedom from Torah, freedom from having to be under the law or whatnot, then in a sense Nanos is describing that this cheapens their own freedom in Yeshua. If that's their perspective on Torah, which is somewhat less than positive, right? It's a bit pejorative. If that's how they're viewing things, then they're cheapening their own freedom in Yeshua. Because indeed, Paul doesn't describe the freedom that Gentiles have as freedom from law. He describes their freedom as a freedom from sin, a freedom from the bondage to sin. And indeed, the privileges that the Gentiles are enjoying, what Paul calls their liberties or their freedom, their what we may call their privileges, as we read later on in Romans that we're going to get to, the things that they consider as strong points, these Gentiles, are actually the fact that they have been brought into the family of God without having to convert to Judaism and rely on Torah for their identity, but also the fact that they have been brought into a relationship with God as a people group who were not otherwise spoken of in the Tanakh on a major level. So the relationship to Israel was not seen readily. It was part of the mystery of the gospel, is that how do the Gentiles fit in? So these are indeed true freedoms that the Gentiles were enjoying, the Gentile Christians. But one of those freedoms should not be described as freedom from the law, is what the point that Nanos is trying to make. And in closing, Nanos says, however, Paul was actually saying that where they were weak, right, speaking of the Jews, where they were weak was not in their faith in God and observance of the mitzvot, right? So they were strong in their faith in God, at least on the way that they described it, and they were strong in their dependency and loyalty to Torah. But the weakness was in their faith in Yeshua as the Messiah. So that was where they were weak in faith, not weak in conscience or something like that. He continues, the Gentiles strong were greater in that faith, but ironically, they weren't that strong either. For why? They became arrogant in their new status and in lacking love, right? The reason that Paul's having to somewhat rebuke them for judging each other in this part of his letter. And Nano says, I suspect they were also weak themselves, meaning perhaps weak in the sense that not that they lacked faith in Messiah, but Nanos is playing with the word weak here. He's playing off the equivocation, the fact that weakness can also just simply describe character of an individual. So some of the Gentiles that Paul was writing to were certainly not believers. They were part of a community, just like anybody can attend church, but doesn't make you a Christian. So yeah, in that sense, if using the label that I'm describing, weak in faith means you're an unbeliever in Jesus, well then we certainly had some Gentiles who would fit the bill as well. And perhaps maybe that's a possibility that Nanos is trying to highlight. So we'll stop there with the Romans 14 study. At about 45 minutes into the study, we'll take the last 15 minutes and look at the Shema study.